This is one of those days where there are a lot of things going on, one hearing stacked upon another, and I know members of this committee have, in 15 minutes, 2 hearings going on simultaneously. So we'll do the best we can to move through this one. I have a short statement I'm going to read. Mr. Lamboyd may also.
If you read it, that's enough.
Mr. Lamboyd has given me permission to speak for him, which is, he will only do once.
No, I mean, I'll read yours too.
Okay, today the subcommittee will hear from the Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, and the Vice Commander of the Space Force regarding the state of military readiness and how the fiscal 2021 operation and maintenance budget requests support military training, weapon systems, maintenance, and efforts to meet the full spectrum of readiness requirements that align with the National Defense Strategy. I'm especially delighted to welcome the witnesses from our newest branch of service. General Thompson, welcome. This subcommittee is interested in, now the hard part, the welcoming's over. This subcommittee is interested in hearing from you regarding the progress made in standing up the Space Force. And from each of the witnesses, we'd like to hear from you about how the department intends to man, train, equip, fund, and sustain the Space Force without impact on the other tasks that you have. We understand that you are early in the process of standing up the Space Force, and that much work is in front of you, and therefore we desire to have today the ultimate plan presented to us. Not likely. For the past several years, we've heard the services raise their concerns with the state of the military's full spectrum readiness after more than a decade of focusing on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency missions. The fiscal year 2020 enacted defense appropriation and the agreed upon defense top line for 2021 represent significant increases in defense spending. I hope today our witnesses can discuss how these additional resources have been executed by the department and where we have seen progress in readiness and areas that still require additional attention. That said, this subcommittee is concerned that the department, and especially the Air Force, remain overly focused on long-term readiness through modernization programs. I feel that you must place more emphasis on investing in near-term readiness accounts that maintain and sustain the systems that we have in place today and will have for the next decade or longer. For example, last year the department only funded 88% of the requirement in your weapons sustainment account, and you did not meet aircraft mission capability standards across the service. In fiscal year 2021, the request for the weapons system sustainment accounts, the full funding will meet 87% of the requirement, a little less than last year. This subcommittee would like to hear from you how you intend to increase aircraft readiness while funding these readiness accounts to a lesser degree than last year. In addition, I'm concerned that the Air Force is still relying on overseas contingency operation funding to meet basic requirements. Notably, roughly 65% in fiscal year 2021 for weapon system sustainment is in the overseas contingency account. Depending on OCO funds for regular and well-understood requirements, such as depot maintenance activity, underlines how institutionalized the department's dependence on OCO funding has become. Going forward, the department and Congress both must be prepared for a world where this will change. And apparently, if the current negotiations in Afghanistan bear fruit, the change is coming sooner than later. Related to the budget request, several issues have caught our subcommittee's attention and that impact the readiness of the force. First, that old favorite, the F-35 sustainment. The Air Force has a stretch goal of achieving a cost per flight hour of $25,000 per hour in 2025. 25 and 25, I believe is the word you use. This committee would like to hear about specific initiatives that you are taking as a service to reduce these sustainment costs and to ensure that you can afford this weapon system as we continue to grow the fleet. The second issue is the aerial refueling tanker availability to meet combat commander requirements. Given the delays in the KC-46A program, this committee is concerned with the Air Force request to retire 10 KC-10 tankers and 13 KC-135 tankers in fiscal year 2021. So how does this work? The concern is echoed in recent Transcom unfunded requirements letter, where it lists these aircraft as the #1 unfunded priority to meet the National Defense Strategy mission requirements. I now understand that the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Esper, says that unfunded priorities are really our priorities, congressional priorities. Perhaps they're both our priorities. The third issue we would like to hear about concerns progress you've made in your effort to close the pilot shortfall gap. Lastly, and as I said, this would be short, but it's not, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the actions taken by the Department last month that disregard Congress's constitutional authority to determine how the nation spends defense dollars. The decision to reprogram $3.8 billion away from military readiness and modernization efforts in order to construct a barrier on the southern border of the United States goes against the priorities of the National Defense Strategy and ignores decades of precedent regarding the reprogramming process. This decision, combined with the $3.6 billion stolen from military construction projects last year, is both disturbing and, in my view, contrary to our nation's security. So, gentlemen, be prepared for questions along this line. With that, I now turn to Ranking Member, Congressman Doug Lamborn of Colorado, for any opening remarks he would like, unless he would simply like to. No, you don't want to do that, Doug. Your turn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we will hear testimony regarding the readiness of the Air Force to execute the National Defense Strategy under the President's fiscal year 2021 budget request. As DoD shifts its primary focus from countering violent extremist organizations to great power competition, our subcommittee will be very interested in how the Air Force balances current readiness with modernization investments. Recent events in the Middle East are a stark reminder of the risk that comes from leaving vacuums for malign actors such as Iran to fill. Today we also hear about the progress in standing up the new Space Force. This recognition of the importance of space as a warfighting domain is long overdue and will be vital to the future readiness of the Joint Force. My understanding is that Space Force will leverage existing support Air Force infrastructure and administration to the maximum extent possible. This is vital to maximizing capability and minimizing overhead. We also eagerly await the Department of the Air Force's decision about the permanent basing location for the Space Command Headquarters. As you know, I believe that Colorado Springs is the best option based on many factors ranging from location, civilian and military workforce, existing infrastructure and capabilities, and quality of life for service members and their families. Now, one of the most important issues in the fiscal year 2021 budget request is the proposed expansion of the Nevada Testing and Training Range. The subcommittee has already heard testimony regarding the importance of this range to support operational readiness. The proposed expansion would enable the Air Force to conduct more realistic training for fifth-generation platforms and engagements using precision-guided munitions. The use of land buffers will protect training resources while preserving natural habitats. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding their progress with stakeholder outreach and engagement with the Natural Resources Committee since our last update. Issues with the fielding of 2 new platforms are creating challenges for the Air Force and adding strain to its already stretched budget. The first one, and this has been mentioned as well, and that is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. While the capability it brings to the fight is a critical game changer, ongoing supply chain issues and problems with the Alice, or is it now Odin, data system continue to create challenges for the program. We also need more clarity about how the program will impact future Air Force budgets. As we ramp up production, the imperative of getting sustainment right takes on even more importance. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses regarding their perspectives about the technical data and intellectual property issues in the F-35 program. I personally don't believe that the department should enter into a multi-year performance contract until all remaining technical data and intellectual property issues are resolved. We would also benefit from your thoughts about how we can shift more sustainment responsibilities to the military departments. The other program with fielding issues is the KC-46A. As of December 2019, Boeing had delivered 30 of these tankers to the Air Force. Unfortunately, ongoing issues with the remote vision system mean that these aircraft cannot yet perform operational tanker capacity. This shortfall caused the U.S. Transcom commander to request that the department defer the retirement of 23 legacy KC-10 and KC-135 tankers in his unfunded priority list. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the way ahead to address these shortfalls. One of the key readiness enablers in the Air Force is the organic industrial base. Our depots provide the capability to maintain warfighting capabilities throughout their life cycles. I am concerned that the Air Force plan to recapitalize the depots will require significant investment over many years at a time when it will continue to have a number of other major funding challenges. And my final concern is about people. This was also mentioned by the chairman. The Air Force has a pilot shortfall of about 2,000, but chose not to fund almost 200 new pilots in the budget request. It is unclear how we will reduce this backlog without full funding. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Indeed, if our staff had gotten together, we could have written one, because what you said is what I would have said, and perhaps vice versa. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses, and thank you for your leadership and the service that you provide to our country, and for representing the respective services today. Let's start with Acting Undersecretary of the Air Force, Mr. Sean Manasco. Did I do that correctly?
You did, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So we never take your support for granted and appreciate the advocacy of this committee and what you provide to our air and space forces, and we're truly grateful. With the prepared statement in the record, allow me to open with just a few key points.
Let me take that up. Without objection, all the written statements will be entered into the record.
Great.
So ordered.
Great. The Department of the Air Force spent the better part of the last 3 decades in a readiness decline with a shrinking force and a procurement holiday. But the 2013 sequester was a major setback for the United States military, I think, as you are aware. And in fact, it did more to damage readiness than any enemy combatant in recent history. But in 2017, thanks to your leadership, that started to change. And over the last 3 years, through consistent budgets, steady top-line increases, and most importantly, your support, we arrested years of readiness decline and began to rebuild the force. Since April of 2018 alone, we increased readiness by 16% across the Department of the Air Force and 35% in our leading operational squadrons. I cannot overemphasize just how important stable and predictable budgets are to morale and readiness. They give us the ability to invest in new programs and to build combat-capable forces ready to compete, deter, and should deterrence fail, defeat those adversaries set upon disrupting our way of life. But we are still too small for what the nation has asked. With the rise of great power competition and the ongoing fight in the Middle East, the demand for air and space power continues to tax our force, driving trade-offs between meeting operational requirements and further restoring our readiness. As we look for new ways to invest in future capability while taking some near-term operational risk, we are prepared to make the necessary choices that are required. We are increasing manning levels in support of new fighters, new bombers, and cyber mission teams. We are funding our weapons systems sustainment and flying hour programs. And most importantly, we're dedicating money and personnel to form the backbone of our newest service, the United States Space Force. Success in the future requires us to make difficult decisions today, and we cannot do it alone. We ask for your help and continued support. And with that, sir, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lamborn, all the distinguished members of the committee, I too want to echo my support and thanks for all your help over the last few years. This marks my 4th consecutive year testifying before this committee. I've enjoyed a front row seat on the readiness recovery that you all have helped enable. And I can honestly say that today your Air Force stands more ready than it has been in years, thanks in no small part to your support. So I owe you my best military advice. We are ready today, But if you ask me, do we have the force structure we need to deter peer competitors of tomorrow? Will we be ready for the threats peering over the horizon? I would answer, we certainly can be. Indeed, we must be. And with your continued support, I'm confident we will be. As I reflect on all the studies we've conducted, the countless hours we've spent with our joint partners examining the National Defense Strategy, and on my own 39 years of experience in this service, there are three fundamental truths that I've come back to. The first is we cannot win tomorrow's war with today's force structure. Your Air Force remains too small and too invested in capability that was simply built for a different time, so we have to modernize. And if we are to modernize in a cost-effective, responsible way, we have to make hard choices now. Choices on both the capability for the future fight, but more importantly, and much more difficult, choices on the Air Force we can't afford and the capabilities that we must divest to enable the transition to a superior, ready force for tomorrow. This budget reflects those hard choices, and we need your continued leadership to see those through. Second, modernization is critical, but it will be irrelevant if it's late to need. If we cede the initiative to China or Russia, then we played catch up for years. We are either leaders or followers in this competition, and history has never been kind to the followers in the matter of war. There is no question that China and Russia are moving out at pace. They have been informed by careful study of our way of war, and they continue to invest in disruptive technologies and to target the very core of our competitive military advantage. Unabated, this risks our ability to maintain a peaceful world order. Your support to ensure stable, predictable, and sufficient budgets, and your willingness to support agile acquisitions that enable timely delivery of capability to our airmen is critical to keeping us ahead of the threat. And finally, I remain convinced that our most important weapon system, America's asymmetric advantage, is not hardware, it's our airmen. And we appreciate your continued leadership and advocacy to ensure they remain the best trained, best equipped, and best led airmen in the world. We have no greater duty than to prepare them for the challenges of peer competition and to care for them and their families as they defend our freedom and America's interests around the globe. Thank you for your leadership and your partnership, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Wilson. Let's go to space. General Thompson.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lambourne, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today along with my esteemed colleagues, and I'm privileged to be one of the 16,000 men and women currently assigned to the U.S. Space Force, serving under the leadership of General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations. These space professionals remain the best in the world at developing, fielding, and operating space systems, the systems that maintain the combat edge of our armed forces and what they enjoy as a result of freedom of action in space. On December 20th, 2019, the President and Congress established the U.S. Space Force as the newest branch of the armed forces, an historic milestone for the nation. Building the U.S. Space Force is our top policy priority. The Department is moving quickly to stand up a lean, agile, and mission-focused organization. While we continue to develop the capabilities, warfighting doctrine, and expertise needed to outpace future threats and execute today's critical space missions. As you all know, the important question when it comes to readiness is ready for what? The fiscal year 2021 space budget continues us on a path of irreversible implementation of the National Defense Strategy, which remains our guide star and our decision-making guide. Progress along the lines of effort in that document increasingly improve our ability to address near-peer threats in space and is sustained by adequate and timely funding of you, our partners in Congress. The U.S. Space Force is pursuing a strategy to ensure we can deter hostile action, defend and protect our interests, and if necessary, fight in, through, and from the space domain. This budget submission includes increased investment in 4 elements of that strategy. First, protecting and defending the highly capable satellite systems we depend on today. Next, fielding a robust architecture that's resilient under attack and delivers space capabilities through all phases of conflict. Then developing warfighters who are the essential part of winning the fight in the space domain. And finally, developing a broad range of options to respond with national security space capabilities if attacked. The Space Force is making significant investments to harden our assets and strengthen our posture in space and on the ground. For example, we're continually improving our space domain awareness network needed for the deep understanding of activities in space to treat it as a warfighting domain. Second, fielding command and control tools that provide both warfighters and commanders awareness, flexible options, and responsive solutions in crisis. In addition to that, we're modernizing vital warfighting capabilities, including improvements in GPS anti-jam and anti-spoofing, and jam-resistant low-probability of intercept waveforms for the family of advanced beyond line-of-sight terminals, which provide nuclear survival communications for our nation's leadership. Assured access to all orbits is also fundamental to sustaining the United States' freedom of action in space. National security space launch investments in this budget increase competition among launch providers, eliminate our reliance on the RD-180 engine, and ensure the space domain access for all of our national security space needs. Likewise, the Space Force is continuing to broaden the space industrial base and bringing cutting-edge technology to space prototyping. Innovative approaches to space acquisition, including space pitch days and the Space Enterprise Consortium, will reap the benefits for the Space Force in terms of leveraging commercial investment, accelerating new technology, and rapidly prototyping and acquiring new systems. With all the physical assets of the Space Force and everything that it has to execute its missions, it's the people who power the Space Force and who are our most important asset. We're developing detailed plans, and by fiscal year 2021, expect to transfer more than 6,000 personnel into the U.S. Space Force. Ultimately, we'll expand that cadre to more than 12,000 space professionals across 15 career fields to protect U.S. interests in space well into the future. Let me close by stating once again that we do not seek conflict in space. However, we must maintain a position of strength and develop a credible warfighting capability in order to deter conflict and maintain a full range of options to ensure our national security. The U.S. Space Force is taking the lead to preserve U.S. and allied interests, to provide capability across the continuum of conflict, and defend our forces, our allies, and our partners. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. In my opening statement, I raised about 7, 8 different specific issues. I won't ask those questions here, but I would expect in the days ahead that we would have a response to those questions. I think I gave you a heads up ahead of time. Again, I don't expect a response here. I know that 2 Air Force bases in California are significantly impacted by the coronavirus and the evacuees from various parts of the world. I'd like a full explanation of what's going on at Travis and March Air Force Base, as well as the Marine Corps bases. I think there are other bases around the nation. So if you gentlemen can develop that and get back to us immediately about that. I will note that there's a public health emergency at Travis, and so the question is apparent. I'm going to go to you, General Thompson, with a quick question. I guess actually it's, well, a question. The California National Guardsmen are already operating space missions for the Air Force and for the Army, including secure satellite communications, space control, space operations, intelligence, ISR, ICBM, and missile defense, a major part of the space operations. I know you're still in the early stages. You haven't figured out how to integrate both the Reserve and the National Guard into your programs. I would urge you to keep in mind that these units have been operating for some time, and if integrated fully, that is, as a unit, I think you'd be well served. And if you were to break them up in some way, then you get to start to rebuild units that are already in place. Bringing to your attention 195th Wing at Beale Air Force Base, 184th Space Operations Squadron, 216th Space Control Squadron, 234th Intelligence Squadron, and then the missile defense programs at Vandenberg. with the 100th Missile Defense Brigade Detachment, which operates the Vandenberg missile defense systems. Keep that in mind. I'm going to forego any more time of my own and pass this to Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just jump right in for Acting Secretary Manasco. Based on the hearing that we had on land withdrawals from military ranges, I have some questions about stakeholder outreach and the status of Air Force efforts to engage the Natural Resources Committee, which has primary jurisdiction on land withdrawals. What's the progress in both of those, stakeholder outreach and discussions with the Natural Resources Committee?
Congressman, we've been in active conversations at the national, local, and state level. And so, as you well know, there's a lot of conversations still yet to take place. I think you mentioned in your opening comments just how important it is that we get this right and the reasons in which we're seeking an expansion. But we have, like I said, active conversations, and if there are others that we need to be reaching out to that we just haven't yet, we stand ready to do so.
Okay, and just so everyone will know on this subcommittee and for the record, why is the current footprint of the range insufficient?
So, Congressman, as we look at the near-peer competitors that we face, it's clear today that the existing range itself is insufficient in size, just given the training that occurs there and the adversary air, which tries to simulate what we would face in a near-peer fight. The range and speed and distance of our adversaries is increasing, and so therefore we need to look at our range facilities with that lens. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention that from our perspective, these ranges are truly a national treasure, and we want to do everything possible to ensure public safety and to leave them in a really great condition.
Okay, and I do realize we're in open session and we can't go into all the details, but I appreciate that answer. Changing gears, during my recent visit, and I was with Representative Scott of Georgia as well, we went to Warner Robins Air Force Base and saw the depot there. I was very impressed with the quality and effort of the industrial work to maintain Air Force aircraft, but I'm concerned about the state of the facilities. My understanding is that the Air Force's 20-year recapitalization plan will cost about $26 billion. How are we going about committing that amount of money each year to achieve that goal?
Congressman, over the last few years, we have committed in upwards of $2 billion for the modernization, recapitalization of these depot facilities. And it should be noted that we really do admire and appreciate and respect the skilled professionals that occupy these depots and do work on behalf of the Department of the Air Force. And so they're of vital importance to us. And lastly, we are committed to living up to the 6% statute to be able to fund, again, their recapitalization in the future. Okay,
and during our last depot hearing in November, the Air Force talked about having the benefits of direct hiring authority, but also about the negative impact of the 180-day military retiree waiting period requirement. If we were to remove that waiting period, at least for certain positions, let's say GS-13 and below, not for the highest grades, but for GS-13 and below, how would that impact the mission capabilities and being able to hire the right people at your depots?
I'll just mention one thing, and I think I'll turn it over to General Wilson. I think he has a point of view on this. But Congressman, we would support any help that you and your colleagues might give us to be able to hire those individuals directly without waiting 180 days. As it turns out, in a very tight labor market, if we're not careful, we'll let those highly skilled people get hired by someone else.
General?
Hey, Congressman, I would echo the same thing. We're in a competition for talent. Anything that slows us down from bringing talent on board lets them go somewhere else. And so as we try and close that gap, we want to look for all the authorities to bring on people as quickly and as fast as possible. And I'll give you a good news story. We've done just that with your help. So some of your direct hiring authorities have allowed us to bring on people much faster. And we'd say maybe in the future we can work with the committee to see where we could expand that more broadly to bring on talent even quicker.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can address that in this upcoming NDAA. And lastly, for General Thompson, my understanding is that the Space Force currently has one member, General Raymond, but we will be gaining 60-some new officers when they graduate from the Air Force Academy in May. You did a good job in your statement of explaining the future missions of the Space Force, but when it comes to making sure that we get the most for our dollars, can you talk about how Space Force will leverage existing Department of the Air Force overhead and support functions so that we can minimize the duplication of bureaucracy?
Yes, sir, thank you. And if I can, before that, I will say there are 16,000 other of us assigned, not yet transferred into, but anxiously looking forward to the day when perhaps we can join him as commissioned and enlisted members of the Space Force as well. And as you stated exactly, we are very much focused on creating the Space Force in a lean, agile, and very mission-focused sense. And what that means is the Space Force itself will focus on developing, acquiring, fielding, and operating space capabilities. That includes an intelligence enterprise required to conduct operations in space, as well as focused cyber warriors who will operate and defend and protect our cyber mission systems in space. Most of the remaining support will be provided by the Department of the Air Force and the United States Air Force in a similar manner to the way they do it today. Base operating support, physical security, civil engineering, our chaplains and JAGs and personnelists, all of that will continue to be provided by the United States Air Force so that the U.S. Space Force can focus on its mission. Our estimate today, when we look at the support functions and field agencies and other activities required to operate the Space Force, about 80% of that activity will continue to be provided by the U.S. Air Force under the leadership of the Secretary and the Department, while we focus on operations and the critical needs in space.
Along that line, I'm sure there are thousands of decisions that have to be made. General Wilson, how are these decisions coming along according to what Lieutenant General Thompson just said?
Well, what I think you're seeing is a seamless integration between air and space, and we're going to continue to remain so. Secretary's been very clear that that's her number one priority, is to make sure that the Space Force is successful, and we're going to do everything we can to do just that.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'd raised the issue of the coronavirus. The 7th Air Force, I think, is in the hot zone in Korea and other places. So if you could, by Thursday, report back to us on what's happening, what your plans are, and so forth.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Garamendi, and thank you, gentlemen, for the opportunity to speak directly to you on critical Air Force and Space Force readiness matters. General Wilson, I'm pleased to see that building a seamless, integrated joint force is the top focus area noted in your memo for achieving the ready and modernized force we need. We all recognize the need to fully use our National Guard and Reserve and the value that investment brings to protecting our nation, our states, and our local communities. In my district, we have many resources, including a very nice open ramp space, ops facility, and hangars where the famous F-16 tacos once resided. That ramp space could add significant value toward military readiness and leverage the synergies between 3 special operations wings stationed in New Mexico. What are some of the best opportunities you see for the department to tap into these kinds of resources and fully integrate the joint force?
Congresswoman, as you know, across the whole force, we can't do any mission without the total force. That it takes the active guard reserve across air, cyber, space, and all the missions across the different pieces of that. You know, if the chief were to say, if you were to go fly in a C-17 today in the Middle East, he couldn't tell if it was active guard or reserve because it takes, they're all there and they're doing that seamlessly. So we continue to look for missions that in New Mexico, of which the Guard could be a significant part of. They are in every mission area, and I think there'll be opportunities in the future of which we can continue to look for opportunities for New Mexico to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that commitment. General Thompson, it was noted in the very recent report to the committee that the DoD intends to establish several Space Force centers or center equivalents to execute space-unique functions that will be co-located with Air Force counterpart centers to the maximum extent practicable in order to leverage existing infrastructure and resources. I will note that my district is home to critical Space Force assets on Kirtland Air Force Base, such as the Space and Missile Center, Advanced Systems and Development Directorate, Space Rapid Capabilities Office, and key Space Force partners like the Air Force Research Labs, Space Vehicles, and Directed Energy Directorates. Given all those obvious synergies, would I be correct in thinking that bases like Kirtland, with its cutting-edge space capabilities, would be on the short list?
Yes, ma'am. I'd like to say, as you listed, there are a tremendous number of capabilities at Kirtland Air Force Base today. It is a national center when it comes to science, technology, research, and development. You listed the research lab, our advanced development division, the Space RCO. Kirtland plays a tremendous role and has for many years in terms of prototyping, researching, and delivering new space capabilities for the nation. I have no doubt it will continue to play that role for the Space Force and well into the future.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And how much time do I have? General Wilson, as the chairwoman of the National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands Subcommittee, I'm paying close attention. Excuse me. I'm paying close attention to the department's proposals that impact public lands that have great environmental value and are key to preserving irreplaceable Native American cultural resources and tribal history. In your view, can the proposed expansion of the Nevada training and testing range be carried out in a manner that both enhances military readiness and is compatible with stewardship of natural and cultural resources? And what are you doing to ensure that Native perspectives on this issue are fully considered?
Congresswoman, the short answer is yes, I think we can, and we have to work together. So to bring in your local and tribal communities have to be part of the discussion and conversation, and I think we can effectively do that to preserve all the things you just mentioned while we also expand the airspace to allow the type of training we need for peer competition.
Thank you so much. And since I have just a few seconds left, I'll ask, while there is a clear readiness argument for the expansion, there are also significant concerns from many sectors. Can the expansions be phased in to allow time to work through the issues with other stakeholders, in your opinion?
Yes, I think they can be phased in.
Thank you. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. General Thompson, let me compliment you on the very adroit dance that you made in answer to the woman's testimony. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Wilson, there's been some discussion about pursuing a long-term performance-based logistic contract for the sustainment of the F-35. Can you share your thoughts about that? Any concerns you may have with things like intellectual property and data rights?
Yeah, Congressman, I'm not sure we have the data yet to be able to jump into a long-term performance-based logistics contract. And so we'll work with the JPO and all the stakeholders as we get better insights into the data, to be able to make a better decision on PBL going forward.
So that's a longer range possibility.
I believe so.
Great. General Thompson, you'll be pleased to know I'm not making a pitch for headquarters in my district. However, if you want to, I mean, how can you, one of the things that drove us to create the Space Force was in the Air Force, there is a culture that's indoctrinated in every service member that you start from the time you join the Air Force, that your number one mission is space air dominance. And it should be. It's the Air Force. How can you ensure that as you stand up this new service, that you can indoctrinate that same mission priority of space dominance into the new members of the Space Force, and as a cultural thing?
Congressman Rogers, thanks so much for that question. In fact, we have for decades been developing a space culture, and we have a space culture inside what was once the United States Air Force and is now the United States Space Force. That culture, however, was developed in a different time in a different area for a different set of missions in a different environment. It's only been in the last 6 or 7 years where we've truly embraced and understood the threat we face in space. And so have begun already developing the culture that is truly a warfighter's culture. And there are several ways that we have done it. The first is, and obviously was the acknowledgement of the leaders and the nation that it was a warfighting domain. The next thing we did is we've already overhauled our training system. Our training system is now focused on threats in space, the development of tactics, techniques, and procedures to address those threats, and ensuring we can deliver capabilities across all of the spectrum of conflict. We've also more closely integrated ourselves with other warfighters, first in the Air Force through Red Flag and some of the advanced training exercises we do, but also the Joint Force through Tier 1 exercises. I will argue there's great value in understanding the cultures of other warfighters that they themselves have different cultures, but understand what it means to develop a plan, to understand your role in the plan, how you're going to develop contracts with other warfighters, and that's been of value as well.
Yeah, I was very pleased, and the committee would be interested to know, in talking with General Raymond a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned, because Air University is in Alabama, that I thought that we should enhance the space curriculum and rename it Air and Space University. And he gently pushed back and said, no, we want our own university.
Yes, sir, you need some of that. And
we'll still use the Air Force Academy as our service academy, but as far as continuing education, and I think that's a great example of saying, no, I want to build my own culture.
Yes, sir, and we've created our own space flags, and we have our own war games. Those are the sorts of things we must continue to do.
Okay, lastly, you talked about growing the number of professionals over the time by 12,000. Is that civilian personnel you're talking about?
So that's all of the above.
Okay.
Right now, in fiscal year 21, we plan to transfer in, I'm sorry, let me make sure I get the numbers right. I've got it written down. In 21, it's about 3,500 civilians, and it's 6,430 military. Over the course of the Future Years Defense Program, it's going to be about 8,100 military and 4,200 civilians. So it is a mixture, as you see, to get to that 12,000. It will be both. Now, I should also say, civilians will be assigned to the Space Force. Like in the Department of the Navy, all civilians will be Department of the Air Force civilians, but they'll be assigned in the Space Force.
Great. Thank you for your service. Now you'll back.
Mr. Rogers, in answer to your question, my grandson, I asked him last week where he intended to go to college. He's a senior. He said, wherever I can get the best education to get into the Space Force.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us today and for your testimony. I also want to commend Congressman Rogers and also Congressman Cooper for the work they did on the Space Force and outlining the importance of standing up the Space Force. I'll get back to questions about that in a minute, but I think it's there's a lot more work to do to help people understand, and the general public, as well as to support you all in standing this up. But I want to start at Readiness and the tankers and KC-135, KC-46A, and what we're looking at there. As you know, Tinker Air Force Base, right there at the edge of my district in Oklahoma City, is the home to maintenance and refurbishment of the ongoing with KC-135 and will be with KC-46A. But quite frankly, we've got a number of concerns about the readiness and what that looks like for our tanker program, because the budget request includes retirement of 10 KC-10s and 13 KC-135 aircraft. Knowing that these aircraft are 70-plus years old, and the force that the civilian contractors, the individuals, armed services at Tinker do an amazing job of refurbishing these aircraft, it is remarkable that they are still flying, and we have to continue to keep them up. But with the challenges with the KC-46A tankers, I'm concerned about this proposed transition and retirement of the 13, and just saw an article from, let's see, I just opened it up, the Air Force magazine that came out about the testimony in front of the Senate, that until the RVS challenge is fixed, the Air Force is not going to commit to using the KC-46As. So I'm concerned about the readiness issue there. So I'd like to find out, and I'll put this, I'll start with you, Mr. Secretary. Is there a plan to put, or whoever is most appropriate, plan to put more KC-135s through the modernization process in lieu of, to help prevent this gap, or what's our contingency plan here?
Ma'am, yes, we are investing in that platform to modernize it. And ultimately, our goal is to get down to a 2-tanker fleet. And like many of our other weapon systems in this budget, we had to take some risk. And so we're actively in conversations with General Lyons and Transcom to make sure that we can do everything we can to cover the needs of that combatant commander. I will make note of the KC-46. I had the opportunity to be on that platform roughly 2 months ago, and I saw it at its best, and I saw some of the limitations firsthand. We are in active conversations with Boeing on what a permanent fix might look like, and we look forward to being able to continue to make progress. And ultimately, if we were to have to go to war tonight, General Miller, I think as you probably may have heard, has said that she would put that tanker in a fight.
Thank you. And following up on readiness and the impact of tankers, but also pilot shortage. Let's talk about that. I happen to agree that I was nodding my head intensely with both opening statements of the chair and the ranking member. I think we're very much aligned. And with the 2,000 pilot shortfall across all airframes, and the reduction in intended pilots, that seems to be going in the opposite direction. And with the need for more pilots, as you look at this issue, how do you plan to bridge that gap when this proposed, the FY21 reduces the number of pilot slots?
Congresswoman, let me assure you, we're not reducing the number of pilots that we're trying to build. We actually have a really good news story. In 2015, we graduated about 1,000 pilots. In 2019, we graduated almost 1,300, and we'll graduate a little bit more than that in FY20. Our goal is to get to almost 1,500, so we've seen a 30% increase in the pilot production over the last 3 years, thanks to your help. And we're on a path to be able to continue that to get towards 1,500, which we think we need. This is a national problem, though. Between all the services, we're going to produce 2,200 pilots, and the airlines are going to hire 5,000. Right? So that's the challenge we face. Our training command has done some remarkable work in terms of what they call Pilot Training Next. And so it's where they go to student focus curriculum that's individualized and using augmented reality and virtual reality to help not only make it better, but also make it faster. So we think there's great potential in that. We're now on to the next phase of it. We're going to try and scale that across all of our UPT bases starting this next year. But we too are concerned on being able to produce the number. But then the next part is I got to be able to season them with the right flying hours, and then I got to retain them on the back end on this process. And we've got efforts underway on the production, the seasoning, and the retention of our pilots.
Thank you, General. I guess, General Thompson, I'll have to follow up on questions later for the Space Force.
Mr. Scott, it may be the coronavirus and the slowdown in the airline industry might help solve your problem.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you're a West Point grad. That makes you Army.
Sir, some have said I've traded up.
I got some family members that would argue with you, but it's, yeah, that I share Congressman Rogers' concern about the focus on air dominance for our troops on the ground. I've watched as the Air Force has tried to get rid of the A-10, has terminated the JSTARS recap, and I'm going to come back to the ABMS system in a minute, but I'm very concerned that if it is going to be the command and control platform for all of the branches, that especially the Army has not been involved in the development of that platform. And now, as I understand it, Army Futures Command has expressed very serious reservations about whether or not ABMS can be the sole command and control platform for the U.S. Army. But you made a statement in the first, stable and predictable budgets. The Air Force is asked to pull the base budget down, and this is the first time I've ever seen any agency or branch do this. You've asked to reduce your base budget by about 20% on the active duty component and increase the OCO funding by almost double it. I mean, you increase it by 80%, and you're effectively moving 50%, if my calculation is correct, approximately 50% of weapons system sustainment to the OCO budget. What is the reasoning for this, and isn't this, from the weapons system sustainment standpoint, this is contrary to what you would want if you wanted stable and predictable budgets?
So let me start by saying, yes, as a young man, I was a soldier, and my middle son is a soldier. And so the efforts that we have underway with ABMS, we are absolutely committed to making sure that we do what we have to do to support troops on the ground. So I want to just start there. That's important to us, and by design, that it will be just that. And we will work very closely with our sister services to bring this concept of JADC2 to life.
Yeah. And if I may, Mr. Secretary, my point is they need to be involved in the development from the ground up.
We couldn't agree more. With respect to the overall budget, sir, so our budget in the Department of the Air Force is roughly $169 billion, and a little over 15 of that is in the space. And so we submitted for the very first time a Space Force budget. And we're committed to weapon system sustainment, but as you may know, to look at the requirements 2 years out in front, we have to make some educated guesses around what those requirements might look like. But in this budget, we have over $17 billion set aside for the WSS account.
But the majority of that, at least 50% of that, is in the OCO section, correct? Over $8 billion of the $17 billion has been moved to overseas contingencies operations, which actually makes it, quite honestly, more subject to reductions. Most agencies want a higher base budget and less OCO because from a long-term planning standpoint, it's just more stable and helps you plan for the future. OCO is something that may happen, may not.
Sir, on those numbers, I just want to make sure that we have the exact same ones. And so if it's okay, I might come back to you because you raised a really good question, but I think there might be some confusion in the numbers themselves.
Okay, so I'm happy to take for the answer. I'm looking at a base budget for 2020, $42 billion. Base for 2021 requested 34. OCO in the center of the active duty component. OCO for 2020 is 10.3. OCO for 2021, 17.9. And in the explanation, the majority of that plus up is a transfer from weapon system sustainment. I'm happy for the Air Force to get back to me with a more detailed answer, but typically speaking, base budget is better for than OCO.
We'll take that, sir, and come back to you.
Thank you.
Mr. Scott is into a very important issue about where the money's coming from. The OCO account, which he correctly points out, is used for sustainment. The question is why that? How do you intend to transition away from that into your base budget? Those are all questions that we would expect to get back to you with. I know the staff is going to be coming to you with a series of questions along that line. Also, with regard to weapons account and your balance, how you deal with that. It's been drawn down. You're going to rebuild it. There's some issues about the flow of money in and out of accounts. And so staff is going to go into that in great detail. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll start out a little bit light here in the mood on the front end. I noticed that recently the Space Force has figured out their cami uniform, and so the only thing I would suggest you're going to have, you call what you're wearing today service dress alphas. That's what we call them in the Marine Corps. You know, I applaud our brothers in the Army for making the decision to go back to a World War II era of the belt, because in a real sense, but also what we talk about here in limited resources, a belt where well worn shows where the excess is. And, you know, the point is, on this committee, we look to where we're spending our money, where we're appropriating the money, and then you're spending the money, and where we can be a partner with you to help you achieve your mission accomplishment. So, you know, we're in a situation where belt tightening has to happen from time to time. So just consider that when you're, as the Space Force, when you're considering your service alphas, a well-worn belt, you know, would look probably pretty good. Now, I know we've heard a little bit of comment about where you might want to put some, you know, headquarters, you know, other than Colorado Springs. But, you know, I'm not suggesting we don't put it there, but I guess as you look at Space Force, are there any opportunities or considerations for, let's say, a northern tier presence as we look at things, like not building new bases necessarily, but using capabilities that already exist to look at what you're going to be doing as a Space Force to counter hypersonics, which is, you know, horizontal launch, or, you know, difference in vertical launch, or telemetry as you're matching the satellites with autonomous vehicles on the ground, or anything like that? Is there anything that you care to share with us at this end as far as the future?
Congressman, yes, if I can. In fact, as a result of the establishment of the Space Force, and as we develop the organizational structure associated with it, field commands, what we've done in essence with that and with Headquarters U.S. Space Command basing is we're now going to take a holistic look at all of the potential options, all the potential locations. We've been directed to go back, open up the aperture, and look at all of them. And so that includes bases. It includes perhaps some non-traditional locations. We will absolutely establish the criteria we need for each of these organizations and then base them accordingly.
Yeah, is one of those criteria going to be potentially, not necessarily co-locating with, but at least sharing facilities with commercial space?
Sir, we're going to develop all of those criteria. Some of those may be exactly opportunities with commercial space. They may be opportunities with civil space. They may be opportunities with, certainly will be opportunities with the Air Force, perhaps other organizations. We're absolutely, we've been challenged by our leadership to look at that whole problem a little differently than we have in the past.
Okay, well, I look forward to, you know, as you move forward with those decisions, how you're going to marry in the public and private sector, if you will, to get the capabilities up to speed as quickly as possible, leveraging, you know, in this case, private sector technologies. I want to switch subjects here for my last, you know, few seconds. This budget request increases pay for flying hours by $6.6 billion. What does this equate to an average monthly flying hour per pilot? Can anybody throw that out there? And is that enough to maintain proficiency?
Congressman, I can't give you an exact specific, but I can tell you over the last few years, we've seen flying hours increase from about 15 hours per month now to about 19 to 20 hours per month.
Now, that's seat in the airframe?
That's seat in the air.
Okay, and how many simulator hours is that pilot getting a month to, let's say, do the mission prep, all of that in the simulator, where it's a whole lot cheaper and a better training environment than before they strap it on and get airborne?
Yeah, Congressman, we're balancing both, right? Because we're also upgrading our simulators to be able to do this, so I can connect virtually and actually do large force exercises connected, distributed through simulators. And so simulators and moving forward with our sim infrastructure is a big part of it. But we're balancing both to be able to do it in the sim as well as There's nothing like doing it in the air, but real time.
Yeah, and we're in an unclassified setting here, so you know that the training and capabilities that we're going to need in our pilots with the airframes we're flying like the F-35 and others, whether they be manned or unmanned, that best training initially to get them switchology, if you will, or thinkology, or whatever you want to call it, is going to be the first phase in the simulator. And I guess the only thing I would, and I'm pretty sure you would agree with this, that you can create an airframe quicker than you can create an experienced pilot.
I agree.
Okay, so as we go forward in pilot retention, knowing that the market for commercial pilots is going to be good and the family always gets a vote, as we leverage that experienced pilot and keep them in a seat, whether it's in a Air Guard unit, whether it's in an Air Force Reserve unit, whatever it is. I want to compliment the Air Force, where when you went with the associate squadrons well over a decade ago, and because that's the model going forward. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I would ask you a question, sir. Where you learned in the Marine Corps about the purpose of a belt?
Our Class A uniforms have always had an external belt. Look at, just put, since the Navy's not here to defend themselves, I'm just going to have a Marine office, since we're both, by the way, Department of the Navy. So, by the way, if the Space Force wants any tips and tricks about dealing as a department within a bigger department, the Navy wears the double-breasted, navy blue coat, and sometimes it is a good camouflage in its own right. Whereas the belt on the Marine Corps, we are a very physical service, so that's where I was going with the belt.
I appreciate the information. It is invaluable. Gentlemen, we have another hearing going on simultaneously to which 2 of us or 3 of us should be attending. There are a series of questions. I draw your attention to Mr. Lamborn's opening statement, in which he raised several points, as did I. We have concerns about all of these issues. Staff will be back with you, and the questions I've asked, one of them is very timely, the corona, how it affects readiness. I mentioned Korea, Italy, United States, so forth. So please get back to us with that. At this point, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for your testimony. Oh, my pleasure.
Not hard, as long as you